Imagine this. It's the year 1478. Albania has fallen. The last fortresses have gone silent. The double-headed eagle that once fluttered defiantly across the mountain slopes has been torn down, replaced by the crescent moon of the Ottoman Empire. On the map, the resistance is over, but inside a crumbling church in Leja, the war refuses to die. Within shattered stone walls, a group of janissaries, the most elite, most feared soldiers in the world, is behaving like madmen. No formations, no discipline, none of the iron order that made them legendary. Sledgehammers crash down on a marble tomb, each blow echoing through the damp air like a strangled thunderclap. They're not looking for gold, not relics. When the tomb finally cracks open, hands dive in clawing through dust and decayed bone. One snatches a rib, another grabs a brittle yellowing finger joint. Someone else rips off a fragment of skull and stuffs it beneath his armor right next to his heart. They curse shove and nearly kill one another, all for the same reason. They believe the bones hold power. They believe that carrying the remains of the man buried in this tomb will make them invincible. Bullets won't pierce, swords won't cut, death won't dare come close. But the man in this grave wasn't a saint, not a pope, not a king. He was Skanderbeg. It's been 10 years since he died. 10 years. For an empire that swallowed kingdoms in a single campaign season, 10 years is a blink. And yet they came back, not with cannons, but with hammers. Not to conquer land, but to desecrate a tomb. Why? Why would an empire that crushed Constantinople and made Europe tremble still fear a dead man? Why would soldiers trained from childhood to scoff at superstition now believe that a handful of bones could keep them safe? Among the crowd, one young janissary stands out. His face is still smooth, with youth eyes caught between awe and confusion. Born in some forgotten Christian village, taken as a child, he was taught that the past means nothing. The empire is everything. The sultan is everything. But as he picks up a small bone, so light it feels like it might dissolve in his palm. A strange thought slips into his mind, cutting through all the lessons drilled into him at the barracks. If this man is dead, and we're still doing this, then what was he like when he was alive? No one ever taught him how to answer that, and no one wants to know. Because what the Ottomans feared wasn't bone, it was a memory. It was a symbol. It was a story that had slipped beyond the reach of swords and ledgers. Skanderbeg didn't just defeat Ottoman armies. He did something far more dangerous. He shattered the illusion that the empire was unstoppable. For 25 years, from 1443 to 1468, the name Skanderbeg turned the Albanian mountains into a graveyard of soldiers. Every summer, the Ottomans marched in. Every winter, they limped home fewer than they came. There were no grand final battles, no cinematic conclusions, just exhaustion, losses, the feeling of being hunted on land they thought was already theirs. Skanderbeg didn't need to win every time. He only needed to never lose. And for an empire that thrived on unstoppable expansion, not losing was already a kind of defeat. The Ottomans tried to kill him in life. They failed. They tried to smear him in death, called him a traitor, an ingrate, a wolf raised in the Sultan's house who turned on his master. But that story wasn't strong enough, because the generals who faced him in battle knew the truth. If he were just a traitor, he wouldn't have forced two sultans to personally lead armies against him. So when they couldn't kill the story, they tried to kill the symbol. Digging up his grave wasn't superstition. It was the act of an empire trying to convince itself that everything could be broken, even memory, even myth, even marble. But the moment those bones were stolen, the opposite happened. Skanderbeg lived again, because no one digs up the grave of a nobody. You only dig up your obsession. The young janissary clenches the bone in his hand. He doesn't know if he's holding a talisman or a curse, but he knows in that instant that Skanderbeg will never just be a name in a dusty book. He is now a question one that haunts the minds of those who believed they had conquered the world. Was Skanderbeg a man of flesh and blood, Or was he the phantom wound in the mind of an empire that thought itself invincible? This story begins with that fear. Even as the tale of the desecrated grave spread across the Balkans, like a curse, one question lingered behind, all the fear, a question so uncomfortable that both Skanderbeg's enemies and admirers avoided it. Before he became the Dragon of Albania, before he was a symbol that made an empire tremble with a hammer in hand, who was he? And more importantly, how was he made? There was no pure Skanderbeg born from the mountains, no child who grew up hating the Ottomans from the moment he first held a sword. The real story begins with a rough knock on a door sometime in the early 15th century when Ottoman tax collectors entered Christian villages across the Balkans, looked parents in the eye, and pointed at their sons. Devshirme, the blood tax, is often remembered as barbaric theft. And it was theft. But it wasn't madness. It was a system cold, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient. The Ottomans weren't looking for children to kill. They were looking for children to raise, to sharpen, to reprogram. The strongest, brightest, most promising boys were taken severed from family faith and memory. In return, they were given something most of Europe couldn't offer, at the time education discipline and upward mobility not based on noble birth. Devshirme was cruel, but it was also a talent machine like no other. Among the boys taken was Gheorghe Castrioti, the one the world would come to know as Skanderbeg. When he left home, he wasn't a hero. He was a high-value political hostage, and the Ottomans didn't waste their investment. Skanderbeg was trained in the best military schools, taught strategy horsemanship, archery swordsmanship, and most critically, how to think like an officer of empire. He learned to command, to manage lands, to wage war not through emotion, but through logistics and timing. 20 years. That's the longest and most uncomfortable gap in the Skanderbeg legend. Those 2 decades are rarely sung about in heroic ballads. There are no midnight oaths, no carefully recorded conspiracies. Just one stark truth: Skanderbeg served the Ottomans, not as some reluctant outsider, but as a real commander. He led cavalry. He governed provinces. He fought for the empire and fought well enough to earn trust, which makes the question even sharper. If Skanderbeg was only a victim, why did he rise so fast? If rebellion burned in him all along, why is there no trace of earlier defiance? Or is the truth harder to accept, that for a long stretch of his life he didn't resist? He adapted. He leveraged the very system that consumed him. And here the legend begins to crack. Because without the Ottomans, would Skanderbeg have become the man we know? Without Devshirme, without military schooling, without experience commanding thousands of cavalry under disciplined formations, could a minor Albanian lord have held off an empire for 25 years? There is an inescapable paradox. The enemy forged the weapon that would later wound them. Seen through this lens, Skanderbeg's act in 1443, turning his back on the Ottomans after the Battle of Nice, no longer looks like a spontaneous burst of patriotic fury. It looks like a cold political calculation. Times were shifting. The empire was struggling in Europe. An opening appeared, and Skanderbeg, with full knowledge of the Ottoman machine, knew that if he didn't act, then he would remain a cog in it forever. So was he a traitor, or a man returning to his roots? That depends on where you stand. To the Sultan, he was a betrayer beyond forgiveness. To Albanians, he was the stolen son who finally found his way home. But perhaps to Skanderbeg himself, it was never a moral question. It was a survival one. He couldn't be both an Ottoman and a son of Albania. Sooner or later, he had to choose. What keeps history silent isn't a lack of records. It's the inconvenience of what those records reveal. Admitting that Skanderbeg was trained by the Ottomans is admitting that there are no pure heroes. Admitting he once served the empire is admitting that the line between oppressor and oppressed isn't always clear. Some people are swept into the current of power, learn to swim within it, and one day turn around swimming upstream with every skill the current once gave them. Maybe Skanderbeg wasn't waiting to rebel from the beginning. Maybe he was just surviving, rising, watching. Maybe for those 20 years, he wasn't a sleeping dragon, but a wolf learning to hunt by the rules of a larger pack. And when he left, he carried more than a sword. He carried knowledge of fear of weakness of an empire's habits. That's why 10 years after his death, they still dug up his grave. Not because he was a savage from the hills, but because he was the Ottoman system's greatest flaw, a child stolen, trained too well, who came back asking the one question empires hate most. If we created our greatest enemy, are we truly invincible? And from that moment, Skanderbeg's story was no longer just a tale of a hero who resisted conquest. It became a story about how power gives birth to the very cracks that can one day undo it. Skanderbeg's betrayal did not begin with a trumpet or an oath beneath a flag. It began in chaos, in smoke blood, and the breakdown of discipline, the only thing holding empires together. November 1443, at Nice, the Ottoman army was being pushed back. It wasn't a catastrophic defeat, but enough to turn the battlefield into a maze of conflicting orders, false reports, and fears spreading faster than blades. And in those moments when power loosens its grip, the clever always see opportunity. Skanderbeg didn't charge the enemy. He did not need to prove courage. Instead, he turned his back. 300 Albanian cavalry followed not for a flag, but for the man leading them. They withdrew in order, cutting through a battlefield, collapsing into disarray. But escape wasn't enough. To become a true enemy of the empire, Skanderbeg needed something a sword couldn't give legitimacy. And so the hunt began. Not for soldiers, but for one man, the Sultan's secretary-keeper of the imperial seal. The man who held authority on paper was pulled from the crowd. No speeches, no bargaining, just a blade to his throat and a short command right. A firman, a decree, was hurriedly drafted, granting Skanderbeg command of the fortress at Krua. The seal was real. The handwriting trembled. Before the ink dried, the secretary was dead. No witnesses, no epic ballads. It's a moment many are uncomfortable telling, because this wasn't the act of a knight. This was the act of someone who understood that power doesn't lie in honor, it lies in paperwork. He didn't take Kruho by force. He tricked it into opening its gates. 7 days later, Skanderbeg rode to the gates of the fortress. No siege towers, no cannons, just a piece of paper. The Ottoman commander looked at the seal, bowed, and handed over the keys. It was the most perfect coup in Balkan history. No shouts, no fire, just a lie, written in flawless, bureaucratic style. But every lie needs blood to survive. That night, with Kruha under his control, Skanderbeg didn't declare freedom. He gave orders. The Ottoman soldiers inside, many sleeping, were killed in silence. Daggers instead of swords, hands over mouths instead of war cries. Blood flowed through halls that just that afternoon had flown the Sultan's flag. This is where the story always splits. For those who need a hero, it was the ruthless necessity of war. For skeptics, it was a massacre. Deception, assassination, murder and sleep. There's nothing noble in those acts. But no empire has ever been overthrown by nobility alone. By dawn, the double-headed eagle flew again. Mountain winds pulled the red cloth, taut, as if the stones of Albania themselves were holding their breath. Blood still stained the stone. The scent of metal and smoke clung to the cold air. Skanderbeg stood on the battlements, not cheering, not smiling. He looked down at a fortress taken by a string of actions no patriotic song dares to fully recount. That first night in Krua wasn't a night of victory. It was a night of irreversible decisions. Skanderbeg didn't sleep. He walked the walls, listening to the wind in the cracks, to the breath of the men who had followed him into exile from the empire. He knew that from this moment there was no way back. No firman would save him. No seal would erase his name from the list of traitors. The question spread beyond the walls of Krua as fast as bad news. Was he a liberator or just a warlord? Seizing power through violence, Skanderbeg didn't answer. He knew history would answer for him, and history never cares about purity. It remembers only results. Albanians began arriving carrying both hope and fear. Local lords looked to Kruja like gamblers, sizing up a dangerous bet. Some saw opportunity, some saw a threat. And far to the east, when news reached the Sultan, the fury wasn't just about losing a fortress. It was about something more humiliating. The empire's own system had been used against it in its own language. Skanderbeg didn't defeat the Ottomans in battle. He defeated them the moment he realized their power could be forged, bent, and manipulated. Was that brilliance or opportunism at its peak? Perhaps both. And it's that mixture that made him dangerous. That night, Kruja didn't just change hands, it changed roles. From a border fortress of the empire, it became a direct challenge. The flag that flew above it wasn't just a banner. It was a question aimed at Istanbul. If one piece of paper could open a gate, how many more gates were waiting to be opened? Skanderbeg stood alone on the battlements as morning came. He knew he had just unleashed something. No one could fully control a war without clear rules. And from that moment on, every victory ahead, if they came, would be paid for, with choices like the one made that night in Kruja, not clean, not glorious, but unavoidable. Kruja belonged to Skanderbeg, but Albania did not. In truth, Albania as a nation didn't even exist, not in the way we understand a country. On those limestone slopes and narrow valleys split by rivers and streams, there were only local lords, each ruling just enough land to go to war with his neighbor. They spoke the same language, prayed to the same god, but were ready to kill each other over grazing rights, tax routes, or a rejected marriage proposal. The only thing they truly shared was mutual suspicion. Skanderbeg understood this before the blood in Kruja had even dried. Taking a fortress didn't mean taking a country. One man can lead an army, but he cannot command those who refuse to listen. And worse still, to many Albanian lords, Skanderbeg was still a dangerous outsider. A man who had worn Ottoman robes too long, spoke the enemy's language too fluently, and brought with him the habits of an imperial court into a mountain world that settled things with daggers and spoken oaths. Skanderbeg's greatest problem wasn't the Ottomans. It was the very people who were supposed to be on his side. If the Ottomans were a storm from the east, the Albanian lords were stones refusing to stack into a wall. Each believed he could survive by yielding at the right time, betraying the right person. Balkan history was full of such short-term bargains. They didn't want a king. They wanted time. Skanderbeg couldn't command them. He had no throne to offer, no treasury to buy lasting loyalty. So he did the only thing he could. He told a story, but it wasn't a tale of glory. It was a tale of fear. In March 1444, at Leja, Skanderbeg summoned the lords. The location wasn't random. Leja was under Venetian control, a neutral ground where no one held an absolute advantage. The lords arrived with armed retinues, hands resting on sword hilts. No one trusted anyone. No one knew if they'd leave that church alive. They expected a coronation speech, a declaration of power. But Skanderbeg gave them neither. He didn't speak of crowns. He spoke of cannons, of the armies the Ottomans could raise, of fields that would burn, of fortresses that would fall. He didn't promise freedom. He promised extinction if they remained divided. This was not the birth of a nation. It was the formation of a coalition of Fear the League of Leja, a fragile military pact where each lord agreed to contribute troops and money but kept his autonomy. No constitution, no shared flag. Only a silent agreement: stand together or fall one by one. Those who followed Skanderbeg didn't do so for some abstract idea called a homeland. They followed him for two very real reasons. First, they feared the Ottomans more than they feared him. Second, they feared losing their land if they stayed out. Skanderbeg became the least terrible choice in a world full of terrible options. Here is where the national myth began to be politicized. Later people would say the League of Leja was the moment Albania awoke, but at the time it felt more like a group of men backed into a corner than people discovering their identity. The alliance was always on the verge of collapse. One failed campaign, one missed promise of support, one insulted ego, and the whole thing could fall apart. Skanderbeg knew this. He understood that military strength alone wouldn't hold it together, so he had to do something harder, become a symbol. Not just a victorious general, but the embodiment of resistance. He had to appear at the right time, in the right place. He had to win just enough to feed hope, but not so much that the lords feared him more than the Ottomans. Every battle, every retreat, every appearance before his troops was calculated. Skanderbeg didn't just fight wars, he played a role. A man once trained as an Ottoman commander, now leading a loose alliance of mountain lords against the very empire that shaped him. That story spread faster than any decree. It gave people the sense that if Skanderbeg could turn on the empire and survive, then perhaps Albania, still just a vague idea, could survive too, but symbols always come at a cost. Every time Skanderbeg won, the alliance grew stronger. Every time he struggled, suspicious glances returned. Some lords kept their escape plans ready. Others sent double-faced envoys, swearing loyalty while probing the Ottomans. The League of Legia was never a unified bloc. It was a deal renegotiated every campaign season. Skanderbeg couldn't let that show. He had to maintain the image of an Albania that existed, even if in truth it was still being imagined. He turned small victories into grand narratives. He turned survival into triumph. And most importantly, he made it seem more dangerous to be outside the alliance than inside it. Perhaps that was Skanderbeg's greatest genius. Not in commanding troops, but in making people who didn't want to be a nation act, however briefly, as if they were one. Albania under his hand wasn't discovered. It was invented, battle by battle promise, fear by shared fear. And like everything built on fear, the structure always trembled before the next strong wind. Skanderbeg knew that if he fell, or if one defeat struck hard enough, the story he told could collapse. But as long as he stood, Albania, fragile unfinished, would live on in the minds of those who had never imagined they belonged to the same thing. It wasn't a nation in the legal sense. It was an idea fighting not to disappear. And Skanderbeg, from that moment on, was no longer just the man holding the sword. He became the one keeping the idea alive. From the moment Albania was invented as a fragile idea, war changed shape. No more battles fit for tapestries, no more knights galloping across open plains, no more clear-cut moments of victory and defeat. What unfolded on the slopes of Albania was a kind of war that was neither beautiful nor noble, and certainly not fair. It was guerrilla warfare, the weapon of the weak, and a silent admission that no other option remained. Skanderbeg knew the imbalance well. Even with the League of Legia, even with reluctant contributions from lords, he had at most a few tens of thousands, mostly peasants, hunters, goat herders more accustomed to climbing hills than holding formation. Facing them was a war machine capable of mustering hundreds of thousands with cannons, logistics, and the experience of conquering continents. A conventional battle would wipe Albania out in a single summer. So Skanderbeg did not seek glory. He sought to wear the enemy down. The battles became hard to name. Ambushes in the woods, attacks on supply lines, followed by vanishing, burning villages before the Ottomans arrived, so there would be nothing left to loot, blowing up bridges, poisoning wells, and retreating at the right time. There were no decisive victories, only repeated losses. Every day the Ottomans remained in Albania was another day they bled money soldiers and morale. To the Ottomans, Albania quickly became a costly swamp, not because the Albanians were unbeatable, but because they refused to offer the empire a proper fight. Ottoman commanders complained they couldn't force the enemy to show themselves. Their army worked best when facing orderly lines, when cannons had targets, when discipline overwhelmed chaos. But in Albania, everything melted into mountains and trees. The enemy came like shadows, struck hard, and disappeared before formation could form. But this kind of war wasn't paid for by the Ottomans alone. It was paid first and hardest by the Albanians themselves. Imagine a farmer living on the edge of a valley. He doesn't read chronicles. He doesn't understand strategy. He only knows to plant in one season and harvest in another. One day Skanderbeg's men arrive. They don't ask. They command. The granary must be burned. Livestock that can't be taken must be killed. The family must abandon the home and flee into the mountains. Otherwise, the Ottomans will take everything they say. The farmer looks at his golden fields, his family's year of labor, and lights a flame. Smoke rises. The scent of burning wheat mixes with hopelessness. Weeks later, the Ottomans arrive. They find nothing. Furious, they unleash their wrath on what remains stone walls, orchards, and the elderly who couldn't flee. The farmer returns to ashes. His land is dead. For him, there is no victory, only the fragile survival caught between two forces, both claiming to defend him. This is the dark side of guerrilla war that no ballad wants to sing. There is no clear line between soldier and civilian. Nowhere is truly safe. Desperation becomes doctrine. Skanderbeg knew this. He did not expect gratitude from the people every day. He only hoped they could endure long enough for the Ottomans to grow tired first. And they did grow tired. Every campaign in Albania felt like throwing money and blood against a stone. There were no grand cities to take, no treasures to plunder, only mountains, forests, and people who refused to die on the empire's terms. For an empire built on endless expansion, this deadlock was poison. A victory with no economic reward is an empty one. But inside Albania, exhaustion built too. Villages emptied, children were raised in caves, not fields, and people began to whisper dangerous questions. How long will this go on? What is the point? Freedom is a luxury when your stomach is empty. And it was here that the alliance began to crack. Some lords rethought their choices. Perhaps striking a deal with the Ottomans, paying taxes, keeping land, was better than endless war. Skanderbeg had to walk a razor's edge. If he eased the pressure, the Ottomans would return stronger. If he pushed too hard, the people would break. Guerrilla warfare allows no rest. It demands constant tension, a life where war is not an event, but a condition. Later historians would call these tactics brilliance, but at the time they felt like desperation, not strategy. Skanderbeg did not choose guerrilla war because it was elegant. He chose it because there was nothing else. Every ambush was a gamble. Every burned village is a scar on Albania's own body. And yet in this unromantic truth, Skanderbeg's war worked. The Ottomans could not finish it. Europe began to notice something was dragging the empire down in the Balkans. Not a great army, but a war that refused to end. Albania became a mirror reflecting the limits of brute force. The farmer looking at his scorched field did not think about history, but history later would look at those blackened fields as proof of a bitter truth. Sometimes, for a nation to exist as an idea, real people must survive in unlivable conditions. Skanderbeg's guerrilla war was not a tale of dazzling victory. It was the story of lasting one more day and then another, until the enemy had nothing left to give. And in that long delay, Albania starved. Burned broken had not yet disappeared. War that drags on doesn't just dull blades, it wears people down. And long before swords break, people usually do. In the years when Albania was squeezed between mountains and cannon fire, betrayal didn't arrive like a sudden lightning strike. It crept in quietly like exhaustion, like hunger, like a whispered question in the dark. Is there any other way out? Skanderbeg understood this better than anyone, because those who betrayed him were not strangers. They were men who had stood beside him in battle, shared the last piece of hard bread, and watched him bleed. And because of that, betrayal became the clearest mirror of who Skanderbeg really was, not in victory but in how he faced collapse from within. The first to shake the alliance was Moise Golemi. Moise was no coward. On the contrary, he was one of the finest commanders of the League of Legia, trusted with independent command, a rare honor in a coalition built on suspicion. That was what made his betrayal so painful. When Moise abandoned Skanderbeg for the Ottomans, it wasn't just the loss of a general. It was the loss of trust. No one knows the exact moment Moise decided to leave. Maybe it was after a winter of hunger. Maybe after an ambush, he barely survived, or maybe it was simply the moment he looked ahead and saw no end. The Ottomans offered land rank, stability things a guerrilla war could never promise. For Moisey, betrayal wasn't selling his soul. It was trading an endless war for a visible exit. When Moisey returned with Ottoman forces, many believed it was the beginning of the end. If one of the men who knew Skanderbeg best could turn away, who could still believe in victory, but history bent another way. Moisey was defeated not because he lacked knowledge, but because Skanderbeg understood that traitors always expect the world to remain unchanged. Skanderbeg altered the rhythm, shattered the very patterns Moisey thought he understood. Defeated Moisey came back. He arrived at night, unarmed, carrying a rope, the sign of a man ready to die. The army expected a single outcome. In medieval logic, betrayal was unforgivable. Killing Moisey would have sent a clear message: no one is allowed to leave. Skanderbeg did not do it. He removed the rope from Moisey's neck and embraced him before the soldiers, not out of blind mercy and not purely out of compassion. Skanderbeg knew that killing Moisey would mean killing another piece of Albania. He could not afford that luxury. Every man who could still hold a sword mattered more than a moral lesson. His forgiveness did not erase the betrayal, but it transformed it from a fatal wound into a warning. The second betrayal was different. Hamza Castrioti did not betray out of exhaustion. He betrayed out of ambition. As Skanderbeg's nephew Hamza grew up beneath a shadow too large to escape, every victory Skanderbeg won was a reminder that his own turn would never come. In a war where reputation was power, that was enough to plant resentment. Hamza carried with him knowledge paths, signals, and the belief that he understood Skanderbeg better than anyone. He thought blood ties were the key. When he led Ottoman forces back into Albania, it wasn't merely a military move. It was personal, a declaration that he was the rightful leader. But Hamza misunderstood one crucial thing. He knew Skanderbeg's tactics, but not the man himself. When battle came, Skanderbeg did not fight as Hamza expected. He changed. He fought with ruthless simplicity. When Hamza was captured, there was no forgiveness, no embrace. He was not executed; that would have been too merciful. He was imprisoned, sent far away, erased from the battlefield he longed to command. The difference between Moisey and Hamza reveals everything. Not all betrayal is the same. Some are born of desperation. Some are born of ambition. And Skanderbeg's response to each followed a cold logic: forgive when forgiveness keeps Albanians in the ranks, punish when betrayal threatens the fragile structure of the alliance itself. Seen more broadly, betrayal in Skanderbeg's war was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a conflict with no clear end. When war becomes permanent, loyalty is no longer assumed. It must be negotiated, maintained, and sometimes purchased with tolerance. Skanderbeg was not blind to the danger. He knew every act of forgiveness was a gamble, but he also knew that internal bloodshed was the fastest road to collapse. The Ottomans could lose men. Albania could not. Every execution for betrayal was a gift to the enemy, and so betrayal became inseparable from the story, not as proof of weakness, but as evidence of the crushing pressure the war placed on human beings. Who understood Skanderbeg best? Perhaps those who left him and returned, or those who left him forever. They understood the price. They understood that following Skanderbeg was not just choosing a leader, but choosing a road with no promise of an ending. And Skanderbeg in those moments did not appear as a saint. He appeared as a man who understood that to keep an idea called Albania alive, sometimes one must swallow rage, forgive the unforgivable, simply because there is no one else left to replace them. On the other side of the mountains, where war never slept, Europe was listening to the story of Skanderbeg, the way one listens to a safe epic. News of his small but stubborn victories crossed the Adriatic and entered marble palaces where war was spoken of in warm, distant tones as something happening elsewhere. There, Skanderbeg was no longer a man covered in sweat and mud. He became a symbol, and symbols are easy to praise. The Pope called him Athleta Christi, champion of Christ. Court sent letters of congratulations. His name was mentioned at banquets as proof that Christendom was not entirely helpless against the Ottoman Empire. Skanderbeg was lifted up as the shield of Europe, the one thing standing between them and the storm from the east. But once the applause faded, what remained was a familiar silence. No armies, no treasure enough to sustain a long war, no lasting commitments beyond a few letters and vague promises. Skanderbeg received titles relics, sometimes a small amount of money enough to pay soldiers for a few months, never enough to shift the tide. Europe wanted him to stand strong, but not at the cost of standing with him. There was a bitterness that needed no words. Skanderbeg understood that Europe loved the story of him, but not his war. They loved the image of a man holding off an empire from afar, so they could go on arguing, trading, and building in peace. He was the shield, and no one loves the shield. People only love the feeling of safety behind it. On a visit to Italy, Skanderbeg was welcomed with a ceremony. Wide halls, thick carpets, respectful greetings. Then in a private meeting, he sat across from a cardinal. The man spoke gently with concern, as if discussing the weather. "You've done great things," the cardinal said. "You are an inspiration to all of Christendom." Skanderbeg was silent for a long moment. He looked at his hands, hands that had held swords more than pins covered in scars. "Inspiration," he repeated slowly. "Inspiration doesn't stop cannonballs." The cardinal smiled the smile of a man used to living within safe boundaries. "We are trying, but kingdoms have other priorities. Politics is complicated." "My war is not," Skanderbeg replied. "It's very simple. Either I stand or they pass through me." There was no reply, because there was nothing to say. Each man understood the other's position. The cardinal wasn't lying. Europe really was busy with civil wars, personal interests, and fear of facing the Ottomans directly. Helping Skanderbeg just enough so he wouldn't fall completely was the safest option. Helping him enough to win was too dangerous. Skanderbeg left those halls with a familiar feeling alone. He wasn't naive. He never believed Europe would save Albania out of charity. But each time he returned from those journeys, the truth weighed heavier than even his lowest expectations. Praise didn't fill granaries. Titles didn't hold walls. Back in Albania, the war continued its own way, harsh, dirty, unseen. Skanderbeg's soldiers didn't know the title Athleta Christi. They knew hunger. They knew cold. They knew winters when aid didn't arrive because some ship was delayed or because some court changed its mind. Each time, Skanderbeg had to patch the alliance again with his personal credibility, with promises he wasn't sure he could keep. From Europe's perspective, Skanderbeg was proof that the Ottomans could be held back. From Skanderbeg's, Europe was proof that a war not at your doorstep is easy to postpone. He became the buffer, and buffers are meant to absorb the blows so others can remain undisturbed. Perhaps the most painful part wasn't the lack of help, but the clarity of it. Skanderbeg knew he was buying time for Europe, one summer, one campaign at a time, but that time wasn't paid with loyalty. It was paid with gradual forgetting. When there was no bad news, people stopped caring. When the shield still stood, no one thought of picking up a sword. Still, Skanderbeg kept going, not because he believed in salvation from the West, but because there was no other choice. Albania, as he had invented it, existed in the space between praise and abandonment, and it was in that space that he had to fight, not just against the Ottomans, but against a world ready to applaud, as long as it didn't have to leave its seat. This war had no clear end, only continuation, and each day Skanderbeg remained standing. Europe had one more day without facing the storm, but the longer it dragged on, the more alone his role became. The shield grew scratched and cracked, but was still expected to stay in place. And Skanderbeg more than ever understood that history would praise him greatly once he was no longer alive to hear it. Skanderbeg didn't realize the change through a crushing defeat, nor through an unusual victory. He saw it the way only those who have lived long enough in war can see it. The things that once worked started to fail. Ambushes still happened, but the Ottomans no longer panicked like before. Supply lines no longer wandered deep into the woods. Generals who once acted rashly, who fell into traps out of pride, stopped repeating old mistakes. The enemy was still vast, still strong, but more importantly, it had begun to learn. Skanderbeg sensed it even before the name Mehmed started appearing in reports. There was another hand now directing the war, calmer, more patient, less emotional. And when Mehmed II finally entered the war, Skanderbeg was not surprised. He had been expecting this for a long time. Mehmed was unlike the sultans before him. He didn't roar with anger. He didn't react out of pride. He didn't see Albania as a stain to be quickly wiped clean. Mehmed was the man who sat before the walls of Constantinople for months, endured failure, corrected his mistakes, and then returned with bigger cannons and better plans. He didn't believe in fate. He believed in calculation. To Mehmed, Skanderbeg was not a nameless rebel. He was an unresolved problem. What caught Mehmed's attention wasn't how many battles Skanderbeg had won. It was how many years he hadn't lost. In an empire built on the speed of conquest, delay was a dangerous sign. Tiny poor Albania, with no great cities to plunder, was still standing year after year, gnawing at the ankles of a giant war machine. Mehmed read the reports carefully. He knew who Skanderbeg had been. He knew where he had learned the art of war. He knew Skanderbeg understood the empire from the inside, and that was exactly why Mehmed could not underestimate him. These two men in very different ways were products of the same world, a world where power was not for dreamers. Skanderbeg, too, sensed the difference the moment Mehmed personally took command. No more pointless chases into the deep woods. No more impulsive responses. Mehmed didn't try to beat Skanderbeg in a single battle. He aimed to make Albania unable to continue fighting. Fortresses began to rise. Roads were sealed. The empty spaces once used by guerrillas started to shrink. Mehmed didn't chase Skanderbeg. He let him run into new limits. This was no longer a clash between two armies. It was a clash between two ideas of power. Skanderbeg believed that if he could prolong the war long enough, the empire would tire, would turn its attention elsewhere. Mehmed believed that if he tightened the grip patiently enough, the symbol named Skanderbeg would collapse on its own from hunger, from isolation, from despair. And from Mehmed's perspective, that made perfect sense. An empire cannot allow a symbol of resistance to live forever, not out of personal hatred, but for the sake of order. If Skanderbeg survived, others might believe they could resist too. Mehmed didn't want to kill a man. He wanted to kill the idea that resistance could succeed. At this point, Mehmed was the most dangerous enemy Skanderbeg had ever faced, not because he was prideful, but because he wasn't. He fought with logic. Skanderbeg understood that, and because of it, he held no illusions of victory. He only tried not to be erased from the story. Every year he remained standing, the symbol survived. Every Ottoman campaign that failed to bring a clear result allowed the question to rise again. Is the empire truly invincible? Between the two men, there existed something close to respect. Not moral respect, but intellectual. Mehmed knew Skanderbeg wasn't a madman. Skanderbeg knew Mehmed wasn't a foolish tyrant. They both understood they were facing an opponent who would not make easy mistakes. And that's what made the war stretch into absurdity. No decisive battle. No clear end. Only time being worn down land crushed people exhausted. Mehmed tried to erase a symbol with patience. Skanderbeg tried to preserve a symbol through endurance. From the outside, this looked like a meaningless war between an empire and a patch of mountain. But look closer and it was a struggle over who got to decide what was inevitable. Mehmed believed history had a clear path. Skanderbeg believed history could be delayed. And so far, neither had truly won. Skanderbeg did not die on the battlefield. There were no trumpets, no swords clashing through red dust. His death came quietly in a sealed room, his body worn down by years that no blade could bear in his place. When word of his illness spread, it didn't cause immediate panic. War had taught people to expect bad news, but when news of his death finally arrived, silence swept across the valleys. A silence unlike fear. It was the kind of silence when people realize the pillar is gone, even though the roof still stands. With Skanderbeg's death, the fragile thread holding the lords together snapped, not because they betrayed him outright, but because no one remained heavy enough for their promises to carry weight. The League of Lega was not built on laws or institutions. It was built by one man, and when that man was gone, the alliance reverted to what it had always been, a temporary pact between those trying to survive on their own terms. The Ottomans didn't need to rush. They had learned patience. Fortress by fortress, they isolated. Road by road, they cut. Village by village, they forced a choice: submit or disappear. Albania at last fell, not in a single day, but over years in the empire's favorite method, making resistance feel meaningless. Measured by territory, Skanderbeg lost. Everything he held with blood and time eventually fell into someone else's hands. The walls he defended were torn down. The soldiers who followed him either died or faded back into civilian life, carrying stories no one powerful enough remained to turn into policy. But there were things the Ottomans could not conquer. The flag lived on. As fortresses fell, the double-headed eagle did not vanish with stone and mortar. It slipped into memory. It appeared in whispered songs, in bedtime stories told to children, in forbidden symbols scratched behind doors, visible only to those inside the home. An empire could rename land, impose taxes, and force conversions, but memory never signs surrender. The legend of Skanderbeg survived not because he was undefeated, but because he didn't disappear when he was supposed to. Holding back an empire for 25 years didn't produce a final victory, but it created a new measure of failure. People began telling his story not to prove that Albania had won, but to show that Albania had refused to lose in the way it was expected to. On the other side, Mehmed II finally got what he wanted: order. But that order came at a price even he understood. A symbol erased by force rarely dies completely. It simply changes shape. And Mehmed, who respected Skanderbeg's mind more than anyone, knew that digging up graves, smashing statues, and banning names were the acts of late insecurity. If a memory must be destroyed, it means it still lives. The real question of this story isn't about the military outcome. It lies elsewhere. Can a defeated man win history? If winning means holding the land, then Skanderbeg failed. If winning means surviving through time, the answer is far more complicated. Skanderbeg did not save Albania from conquest. He could not stop the Ottoman flag from flying over its walls, but he did something else, subtler, harder to measure. He bought time. 25 years of slowing the empire in the Balkans gave other cities time to build, to fortify, to argue, to grow. In the rear view of history, those years don't look like victory, but like the breathing space that allowed Europe to save itself. And within Albania itself, that time created something more enduring than Stonewall's identity. Before Skanderbeg, Albania was a patchwork of lords speaking the same language, but sharing no story. After Skanderbeg, even in defeat, people began to remember who they were by remembering who he had been, an identity that didn't need a state to exist, one that could sleep for centuries without vanishing. History prefers clear victors, but sometimes it is shaped by those who simply refuse to disappear on cue. Skanderbeg belonged to that group. He did not win by the empire's rules. He won by memory's rules, and memory, unlike land, cannot be occupied forever. When Albanians finally rose to reclaim their country centuries later, they did not begin from zero. They began with a story kept warm across generations, the story of a man who knew he might lose and still stood long enough to make losing no longer feel inevitable. Maybe that is the only victory left when all else is gone. Not the victory of swords, but of insisting that history does not belong only to the last man standing. It also honors those who make history pause, reflect, and remember. Skanderbeg died. Albania fell. But the question he left behind still lives. If the inevitable can be delayed, was it ever truly inevitable? And as long as that question is asked, his victory is not over.